Hello, Archie Dunlop here with Talking Astrology with Archie on Monday, July the 29th, 2024. Today is the 43rd wedding anniversary of Charles and Diana, and I want to look at it. I want to look at the horoscope of the marriage, and I want to look at the horoscope of Charles and Diana, and I want to see whether the marriage chart can actually unfold. Can we actually predict how the marriage would work out on the basis of this chart? Any possibility of that? Now, you might argue that this has really nothing to do with any of us. This is some royal indulgence. This obsession with a royalty is not very healthy. And to an extent, I'd agree with that. I wouldn't have said I was a big royalist myself. On the other hand, whatever your political opinions, it was a very important event culturally in the 20th century. People look back on that wedding. I would guess that it was the biggest wedding of the 20th century, at least in terms of the coverage it got. Plus, in looking at it from a perspective of astrology, we're talking about people we know about. We know who Charles is. He's now King Charles III. We know who Diana is. I don't have to explain it. I don't have to tell you who these people are. And, we have very exact birth times for them. So, as far as I'm concerned, it's a good illustration of how astrology is working. So, yeah, I don't apologise for looking at this, and I think it is actually useful. So it's not about what you think of the royal family, it's about looking at astrology in action. But before I look at the royal wedding, which happened 43 years ago, I want to look at the astrology and the I Ching for today, which is Monday, July the 29th, 2024. And just a reminder, if you do happen to like this video, I would be really grateful if you were to like it. And if you're not subscribed, I'd be super, super grateful if you were to subscribe to this channel. Doesn't cost you anything, but it does make a big difference in terms of this channel and its development. Okay, so let's look at what's going on today. There is a picture. There's Charles and Diana 43 years ago. And so this is the astrological picture at noon today, set for New York, Monday, July the 29th, 2024. The moon is, you can see, is in Taurus, 26 degrees 54 Taurus. So in fact, at noon, New York time, there is a Moon-Uranus conjunction, conjunct Algol. Now it's a short-lived conjunction. It doesn't last very long. But it's just perhaps one more opportunity or there are going to be more opportunities, but just another opportunity for Uranus to have an influence, particularly Uranus on Algol. So with Moon conjunct Uranus, we can perhaps expect things to happen. We might get a fair amount of stubbornness. People are not really going to be in the mood for compromise. And I suppose there could be a certain darkness to Moon conjunct Uranus on Algol, especially when it's very close. I mean, Moon conjunct Uranus is close in New York at around noon. It depends on where you are. If you're in Western Europe, that's going to be sort of 5 or 6 in the afternoon. If you're in Los Angeles, that would be, 9 in the morning or something like that. So it kind of depends on your time zone to an extent, but I just think we should perhaps think generally in terms of broadly speaking, there is this conjunction between Moon and Uranus, which may or may not be exactly on our goal. So there could be some problems with that aspect. Now, Moon in Taurus in general, I mean, Taurus is an earth sign. It's about the material world. A lot of us may be putting a lot of emphasis on the material world, and it's the way things feel, what we can touch, and we might want to really focus on what's in front of us, and that includes money. And some of us might be quite stubborn about it. We might really want to hold on to what we've got, or we might experience other people holding on to what they've got. Now, the moon does eventually change signs. It changes signs and moves into Gemini at just before 10:30 in the evening if you're in London, which would be around 10:28 p.m. technically, which would be 11:28 p.m. if you're in France or Germany. So Moon in Gemini if you're in Europe, right at the end of the day. If you're in, I suppose, parts of Africa as well. If you're in Asia, Australia, New Zealand, don't worry about it. Moon will move into Gemini tomorrow on Tuesday. Now, if you're in the Americas, it's probably more important to realize that the moon is going to move from Taurus to Gemini just before 5:30 in the afternoon in New York. It's 5:28 p.m. Moon moves from Taurus to Gemini. So with Moon moving from Taurus to Gemini, there might be a change. There might be more activity, more mental activity, more talking. And even more so if you're in California, because 2:28 p.m. is when the moon moves into Gemini. So yes, there is a time zone issue with the moon, but I think that overall for most people we can probably regard it as a moon in Taurus kind of day. There aren't actually that many aspects of great note at the moment. The moon conjunct Uranus is the main thing. Moon does make a sextile to Neptune. I mean, that is really a very mild aspect, moon sextile Neptune. It's perhaps about heightened sensitivity. Though I suppose you could say, well, you've got moon conjunct Uranus, you've got moon sextile Neptune, perhaps a feeling that we're in touch with otherworldly forces. And while we're on the subject of Neptune, just a reminder that Neptune is now getting very close to Skeet, that fixed star associated with accidents and disasters. So that really is perhaps something that we do need to take into account. Also, in terms of fixed stars, Mars is in early Gemini, and at the moment I think Mars is conjunct the Hyades, and so when Mars is conjunct the Hyades as a fixed star, there can be just a certain sense of irritation. Just things are a little irritating, and we might sort of get worked up about things that we shouldn't really be getting worked up about, and perhaps some of the negative aspects of Mars in Gemini might be manifesting, perhaps in terms of what we say. Things, we might just respond verbally in quite an abrasive way, or we might witness other people responding in such a way, but we perhaps shouldn't take it to heart. It's probably something just passing. And so, don't get caught on words, and we can be careful in our own language. In terms of other people's language, perhaps we can just tolerate it, just regard it as just a passing phase. Turning to the heliocentric picture, there's not a great deal happening heliocentrically, but it's not that there's absolutely nothing going on. There's Mercury. Heliocentric Mercury is moving towards a quincunx of Uranus. And I would have said that is a similar message to what I was saying with Mars conjunct Hyades. Just a sense of verbal irritation. Mercury is about the words we use, heliocentrically, and it's quincunx Uranus. Just things annoy us, things grate, and we might find it a little bit difficult to respond to outside events which we hadn't planned on, so there just might be a little bit of irritation there. And at the same time, heliocentric Venus in Virgo is moving to an opposition of Saturn in Pisces. So this Venus-Saturn opposition, it's not great. It perhaps represents an overall environment where people find it perhaps a little bit difficult to express themselves emotionally. Not just people, but just the world at large. There may be a certain sense of alienation that some of us might feel. And I suppose Venus is that planet of money, so there might be concerns about money, not just by people, but by governments. Perhaps government realizing there isn't any money. I suppose that's, one thinks of, of a British government who's just, I think they're going to have to put up taxes because, as they're saying that, the Labour government has got into power and realised that the coffers are pretty much empty, supposedly, and that they've got to put up taxes because there just isn't enough money. So that might be how governments are thinking and working with Venus opposition Saturn, but it just may be a little bit mean and selfish, just focusing on those material details and perhaps not considering the human dimension. But overall, heliocentrically, I would not have said that a great deal is happening today. So I can now look at what's going on from the view of the 12 signs. So these are my forecasts for the 12 signs for today, which is Monday, July the 29th, 2024. Aries, I think you are feeling a little bit annoyed. You're not quite sure what you feel annoyed about, but something is just irritating you. And it's nothing particularly major, but you might find that your irritation is difficult to hide. And so I think, Aries, you do have to be careful what you say and how you express yourself, because if you say the wrong things, you might just be making things worse. So be very careful about how you use your energy. Yeah, I understand that Mars is in Gemini, and so with Mars in Gemini, Mars is ruler of Aries. It's tempting to sort of put your energy into the verbal side of things, but you can have too much of a good thing, and perhaps you should be a little more relaxed. And also, maybe you should just take responsibility. You can't assume that other people are going to behave, that other people are going to do what you want. They have their own way of working, and they just can't be pushed. And if you want something to happen, it's down to you, perhaps, to make it happen. And in this sense, I think you can still benefit from the fact that the Sun is sextile Mars. I understand that this Sun sextile Mars is starting to weaken a bit. It was last week that the Sun sextile Mars was at maximum strength. Now the Sun and Mars are 1 degree off the sextile, but that sextile is still very much there. And if you want to make things happen, I'm really confident that you actually can make them happen, and it shouldn't need anyone else's cooperation. You just do what you feel is necessary, and I think that sooner or later you'll be able to really start to make progress. And another thing, Aries, perhaps talking about why you might feel a little bit irritated today, is that at the moment you're going to really value your own freedom. Your own freedom is going to be extremely important to you, and you will expect other people to respect that need for you to be free and for you to do what you want. And I suppose this may link up with this perhaps unfair criticism of Aries, that Aries can be quite selfish. One can go further than that. I've heard people go further than that when being critical of Aries, but I had this astrology teacher, Olivia Barclay, and she said very loudly, we were in a pub in Walton-on-Thames celebrating William Lilly, and she said very loudly, with an Aries sitting right next to her, that basically all Arians are bastards. Now that is of course a total exaggeration, and I've got Moon in Aries, by the way. But what that perhaps reflects is the fact that Aries likes to do things its own way, and likes to, if Aries wants to do something, Aries just goes and does it. And right now, your own freedom is very important to you, and you should just take the view that nothing needs to get in the way of your freedom, and you mustn't assume conflicts. And that's perhaps why you might get a reputation perhaps for being a little bit selfish, but people do need to respect you. But perhaps there are different ways of expressing your freedom. You can express your freedom in a tactful, diplomatic way, or you can just do it without any explanation. So maybe a little bit of explanation might be necessary. And I suppose part of the problem is that at some level you've got this issue that you really want to express your freedom at the moment, but you're just feeling a little bit frustrated at the same time. And I think you mustn't project things onto other people. You mustn't assume that other people are just holding you up. They're not holding you up. It's fine. And within reason, I think you can do what you like. But it's just very important that you're able to take responsibility. Now, at one point about money, there is a conjunction between the Moon and Uranus, and the Moon and Uranus can be a little bit difficult, and there may be a few surprises with money. So in terms of money and how you're looking at money, have your eyes need to be wide open at the moment. You need to see what's going on, and you should try to anticipate what's going to happen next. And if you make financial commitments, or if you do anything with money, or it has a financial implication, then there's just a possibility that it doesn't work out in quite the way you expect. So with money, Aries, I think that maybe a little bit of caution might be in order. Taurus. Today there is a conjunction between the Moon and Uranus. And this conjunction with Uranus is, it's in Taurus. It's in your sign. So with this conjunction, there may be a little bit of hastiness on your part. You might take things too far, or perhaps you will just become rather stubborn. You will be absolutely sure that you've got it right, and you're not really going to be in the mood for changing direction. Now, this might be the right approach, because at the moment many Taurians are going to be I won't say perfectionists, but they're certainly going to want to make the most of what they have. And they won't be satisfied with second best. So today, Taurus, you're going to do whatever it takes to improve yourself and your prospects. And that's a good thing. And you can do it in a way that is really very single-minded. You'll have an idea about what needs to be done, and you will just want to just be able to push it through to completion. And I think that that's perhaps what you need to do and what you can do. And in the process, Taurus, just try to have a little bit of subtlety. Yeah, the moon does make this conjunction to Uranus, but it does make a sextile to Neptune as well. So with that sextile to Neptune, allow yourself to be a little more sensitive than you have been of late. A bit of sensitivity can just make the difference between a harmonious day and a day of arguments. And just understand other people's sensibilities. You just don't be, the literal bull in a china shop, Taurus in a china shop, just causing chaos because it just wants things to happen, not caring what it breaks. That could be moon conjunct Uranus in your sign. And with that moon conjunct Uranus, don't project it. So if things go wrong today, or if there are accidents, mishaps, which could happen with moon conjunct Uranus, there might be a certain tendency to blame it on outside forces, but you need to take responsibility here. And I suppose if you're not getting what you want, then some of that frustration might be pushed out onto the material world, and so you might blame other people, but I don't think that is a good idea. And yeah, a little bit of caution is certainly a good idea with this moon conjunct Uranus, because it can be a bit problematic. But on the plus side, Taurus, you are an individual. Absolutely no doubt about that. You are able to express your individuality, and in some quarters, I do think that is going to very much be appreciated. But just as you're being an individual, just do take into account other people's sensibilities. Gemini. In a way, Gemini, it's a day when you possibly feel that there's not a great deal that you can do. It just might be that you're going to be happiest just watching, perhaps watching from a distance, rather than being directly involved. And I think, Gemini, that in some respects, this approach might be correct, because there are things going on. If you were to get directly involved, it just might be more trouble than it's worth. And so perhaps it's a time for just waiting. Though the moon is going to move into your sign quite soon. Kind of depends where you are. Now, if you are in the Americas, then for some of the day, this evening if you're in New York, this afternoon and this evening, if you're on the West Coast. So for the last part of the day, if you're in the Americas, the moon is in Gemini, and this does create a new energy, and this is a time when you can start to be more of an extrovert. You can perhaps step out into the world. You can start to be more sort of interactive. But if you're not in the Americas, then it just may be a question of just waiting until tomorrow. That really might be the best approach. So this raises a broad question, Gemini, regardless of where you are. What is actually the best way of utilizing the day's energies? Well, consider the possibility that there are things out there to be discovered, or maybe not things out there, maybe things in there. There are things about yourself that perhaps you need to discover, or perhaps rediscover. Because if you can just put yourself in a position where you can just relax and just think and dream, daydream, perhaps get involved in a little bit of fantasy, then in your fantasy world you might drift into something very important and very real. And that very real, important thing may be just about who you are and what you're able to bring to bear. It seems that there are hidden talents that you can start to get in touch with today. It won't be easy. I don't think that you can actually get in touch with these talents if you have a busy, extroverted day when you're with other people and indeed, in other words, doing what perhaps you shouldn't be doing. If you're doing that kind of stuff, I don't think that you're going to be able to make the most of who you are. On the other hand, if you're alone or in an environment where you can relax, when you can afford to relax, then you can start to tune into something and perhaps be reminded of what you're good at, or perhaps what you could be good at. And you might then start to develop some plans. Plans will start to form. Plans which allow you to bring to bear your many talents, or perhaps just a couple of talents, the important talents. It all starts to come together. But it's not a time for action. You're just starting to realize, actually, Gemini, what you can achieve. And it might also be a good idea to just go back over past material, remembering that Mercury, which is your ruler, is now starting to slow down. It's starting to slow down actually in quite a big way, because next week on Monday Mercury does go retrograde, and so perhaps you should be preparing for this retrograde motion. And when Mercury goes retrograde on Monday, this will be a time when you can perhaps do some more reflection. So if you have got plans that are starting to develop in your head, perhaps there's an air of fantasy to these plans. These plans should not be dismissed, but they're going to need a lot of work, and it may actually take until, I don't know, the end of September before you're actually able to put plans which are starting today into action. So I think you have to get an idea about what kind of day it should be, especially if you're in Europe, Asia, Australia, New Zealand. There's probably nothing much out there that you have to do, and all the real work may be in terms of your own world. Cancer. Moon is in late Taurus. So in one sense, that's good news, because Moon is exalted in Cancer. Moon is your sign. Moon is the ruler of your sign. And so with Moon in Taurus, you're feeling good about yourself, and you're quite a reassuring person who I think other people are going to trust. You're going to be reliable. You're going to be there for people, and that's good. But at the same time, you have to be also aware that things might not entirely go to plan. And that is because the Moon is making a conjunction to Uranus. So Moon is your ruler. It's conjunct Uranus. So when you put Moon and Uranus together, you can get unexpected events. And it may not just be unexpected events in the outside world. It may be also about your perceptions and what you want to do, and you might have a change of mind, or you might decide that something is worth fighting for. Okay, not maybe fighting for, but it's worth taking a stand on. Perhaps because it's a matter of principle. And it's also possible that it's just simply a matter of Cancer being stubborn. I suppose stubbornness, on the face of it, is not a word you normally connect with your sign, but on reflection it possibly is. Yeah, Cancer does like to do things its own way. Cancer is very much into its boundaries, and some Cancerians don't like dramatic change. And this stubborn part of who you are, which, as I said, isn't normally a major association, could start coming into play. So if you're in a situation today where you feel that you have to hold firm, that you absolutely mustn't give in, mustn't give way, then consider it. Ask yourself whether it's really the right thing to be doing. I mean, it may be absolutely the right thing to be doing, but Cancer, you need to ask yourself whether that's really what you want to do. And in the process, it's probably a good idea, Cancer, to employ some of your legendary sensitivity. Try to feel your way around the world, or at least feel your way around your part of the world, because you are quite sensitive in a good way, because the moon is making not just a conjunction to Uranus, but it is also making a sextile to Neptune. And because of this sextile to Neptune, which I think in most cases is going to be positive, this moon sextile Neptune, I think because of this moon sextile Neptune, you're going to be able to use your sensitivity to sort of feel your way around. And I think that is probably something to be welcomed. So I'm not saying, though, Cancer, that it's going to be an especially dramatic day, especially if you're in Europe, Africa, Asia, Australia, New Zealand. If you are in the Americas, you may experience a bit of a change this afternoon when the moon moves out of Taurus and into Gemini. So with moon moving into Gemini, there will be a change of approach. On one hand, you're still going to value your own company, perhaps more so than usual, but at the same time, your mind is going to be more acute, and perhaps you'll be less focused on feelings and sort of more focused on ideas. I know that Cancer has a reputation for being a water sign, for being an emotional sign, but many Cancerians do have incisive intellects, and with the moon moving into Gemini, I think you can perhaps take advantage of this. And moon in Gemini allows you to think about things, perhaps from a distance, but still you're able to think about things and engage with the world with your mind. And at the same time, the moon makes a trine to Pluto, which gives you increased incisiveness. And so, if you're in the Americas, and perhaps to an extent, if very late in the day, if you're in Western Europe, you just might have this clear intellectual view of the way things are working out, and this clarity will persist through until Tuesday. But it's not anything that you have to discuss or talk about. It's quite private, privately working out what's happening and perhaps what needs to be done. Leo, you are fairly optimistic at the moment, Leo. You're thinking about all the things that could happen. But I'm talking about good stuff that could happen. And many Leos actually at the moment have a fair amount of faith perhaps a faith in themselves, a faith in human nature. I suppose it could also be religious faith or supernatural faith, a belief, a faith that there is something out there. And I think this is a good thing, provided you don't exaggerate. You are overall, I would have said, well placed. Just remember, the sun is in Leo. The sun works very well in Leo, and as a Leo, you just have a faith that things are going to be fine in that sort of Leo kind of way. Now, it's obviously important that you have a critical mind, that you don't assume that everything is going to go right. But provided you're realistic, I think faith and just a belief that everything is going to be fine in the end is going to be very useful. So if there's something you want to do, but you have your doubts, you have a few doubts, sure, you can address these doubts, but faith can go a long way in terms of getting you to where you want to go. So in that sense, I think that there's real cause for optimism here. But just make sure you have a tiny amount of realism. There's nothing wrong with being a little bit realistic. In fact, you can have faith and also be realistic at the same time. It really is possible. And probably the main aspect going on today is a moon conjunct Uranus. So moon conjunct Uranus it's quite a brief aspect, and when it manifests to its full, does have some impact on does have some relationship rather to your time zone. But with that moon conjunct Uranus, you're going to have a feeling that you want to make things happen. It may just be linked with your faith as well. That perhaps you might feel that just now is the time to move gears. Perhaps you'll even feel that if you don't take action now, you might miss your moment. Well, you do have to be a little bit careful. Do you really want super drama? A bit of drama is nice, but do you want super drama? The super drama that could happen with moon conjunct Uranus. And that would especially be the case if you are working, or if you're in a high profile, if you're doing something business related. You're going to want to get attention, and you might feel that you want to do something that is quite dramatic. And maybe you feel it is necessary to do something that is dramatic, moon conjunct Uranus. But you have to understand that drama can have consequences. If you do act in a dramatic way, in a way that is unannounced and unexpected, you don't really know how other people are going to respond, and they might respond in quite a negative way. So that is a possibility. But still, you are focused, you are stubborn, and in many respects, Leo, you're able to sort of steamroller things your way. So I think that is a real possibility. Now, I suppose with moon conjunct Uranus, there's always a chance that something could happen, perhaps at work, which you were not expecting, that you had not planned for. And you might have fixed ideas about the way things should be. Something happens, you hadn't planned for it, and then you have to rethink everything. So do bear that in mind, Leo, and also take responsibility. And at the same time, you should realize that you are able to make things happen. The sun in Leo is still making a sextile aspect to Mars. We had this last week. The sun sextile Mars is still very much there, and with sun sextile Mars right now, you're able to have quite a major impact if that's what you want. And you decide what you want to do today, and you just go and do it, and I think you will have sufficient energy to see everything through, broadly to a successful conclusion, but in the process you might ruffle a few feathers. Virgo. Virgo, you probably feel that there could be more. That the way it is right now isn't the whole picture. That improvement is in order. That at the same time something may be being hidden from you. You just feel that. You just feel that you're not getting everything. And that may be a great motivator. You perhaps feel that it's time to ask questions and be a little bit suspicious, perhaps, that in any situation, even if you're benefiting from it, that maybe the full benefits are being hidden from you. So do bear that in mind. Even if things are good, it just could be a little bit better. And as far as you're concerned, you should be looking for things. You should be looking for new knowledge. Don't think that you understand everything. Even if it's an area that you feel that you're an expert on, there's still something else that needs to be discovered. And I think today you can actually do that discovery. And so don't be lazy. I mean, I'm sure Virgos are never going to be lazy, but just keep looking, keep searching, and don't keep searching in one place. It's tempting to do that, but you've got to have a certain degree of flexibility. But I think that's something you can do. I think that's going to be okay because, remember, just Mercury is in Virgo. Do take advantage of Mercury being in your sign. You are intelligent, and really you also know what questions to ask. Though Mercury is slowing down. Remember, Mercury goes retrograde in a week's time. And so in some ways you should perhaps be preparing for that retrograde motion. With Mercury about to go retrograde, don't have short timescales. Don't assume that everything is going to be sorted out quickly. And also, because things are starting to slow down a little, that gives you the opportunity to understand what's happening. If you've got things moving very, very quickly, then it's really quite difficult to understand what's happening because it's just too fast. But because things are slowing down, you're able to stop, look, see what the information is, see what you're being told, and that gives you the possibility of real understanding. Now, if you are in the Americas, then you may feel a sign change today. The moon moves from Taurus into Gemini. Now, that sign change takes place London time in the UK, Western Europe, at 10:28 p.m. So that is really very late in the day. So I don't think that sign change is going to be felt to any great extent if you're in Europe, Australia, New Zealand, Asia, Africa. It's more of an American thing. So if you are in the Americas, then you're going to find that over the afternoon, you do feel a sense of change of the moon moving into Gemini. And as the moon moves into Gemini, Virgo, American Virgo, you're going to, I think, become a little more ambitious, but at the same time, you're going to be also a little more open-minded. And you're going to be aware of new possibilities. You might actually become aware of two possibilities. Gemini is a two-bodied sign, the twins. So you might actually become aware of two possibilities. And maybe there's a question of choice. Do you do one thing or you do the other thing? And it's kind of important which choice you take. I don't know whether it's like the fork in the road. I don't know whether it's quite that dramatic, but there is a choice here that is starting to make itself felt. And remember, when the moon goes into Gemini, it does start making a conjunction to Mars, but that moon conjunct Mars that's something I'll discuss tomorrow. I don't think you're going to be really feeling that moon conjunct Mars. So if you're an American, if you're an American Virgo, you might have a slightly different experience of the day than if you're a non-American Virgo, because you do get that moon moving into Gemini at the end of things. And finally, I would have said, Virgo, that you mustn't neglect your spirituality, and not just your spirituality, but your higher unconscious functioning. I think that could be quite important today, because there's a lot going on in your unconscious at the moment, and your unconscious is creating possibilities for you that perhaps weren't available yesterday. I mean, the possibilities were always there, but you didn't actually have access to them. But now you are starting to have access to them, and it's quite intuitive, or maybe it's emotional. But if you just give yourself time and space, you can start getting in tune with stuff. And what you're really talking about is some things you're very capable of doing that you've perhaps in the past have not taken seriously, and these capabilities are available to you. But part of you seems to be in denial that these capabilities can be real. You might just think they're a waste of time. You're perhaps being overly modest about them, but you mustn't be modest. And I think that you're being shown what you can do. Maybe, I don't know, maybe you'll have a dream or a daydream that you're doing something. And at first sight, you're doing something you can't do, that you regard as a complete impossibility. But if you look at it again, it is actually something you can do, but you are maybe totally underestimating yourself. So Virgo, really consider what this thing might be. Give it some work. I'm not saying that you're going to find this new capability and be able to put it into practice straight away and it's going to make a huge difference overnight. It's not like that. It's just getting this inkling that this capability exists. And once you get the inkling, it's because it's a conscious inkling, then you can start acting on it, and you can look perhaps at what your plans are, what you're doing with your life, and perhaps consider what is missing and how you can bring into play this ability. And now is perhaps just the beginning. Libra, you're probably not satisfied with second best at the moment. You do believe that things could be better, and I think that's a good thing. You're going to be in the mood for really pushing yourself, and I don't think there's going to be much in the way of complacency. However good a job you're doing, I think you'll always be aware that perhaps you could be doing a better job. Now, of course, you don't want to be a complete perfectionist. Some Librans actually do have a sort of element of perfectionism to them, or it just might feel that way. That might be because, Virgo is a sign that's very close to Libra, and it can be sort of Virgo planets can stray into the Libra zone. I mean, that's sort of a possibility. But you do want things to be as good as possible. And I think you need to respect that and make it clear to everyone around you that you do have standards. And I think by pushing that message, I think you will get respect, and yeah, whatever you're involved in is going to look good. At the same time, you may feel that it's a time where you need to engage new resources. You're working on something's important to you, but you just feel that it's just something's missing. And so because you feel that something's missing, you may feel that you have to bring new things into play. And so that's perhaps something that Librans need to work on. And as I said, it's not a situation where you have to get obsessed about it. Just do as good a job as possible, and then you have kind of done your duty. Now, as far as other people are concerned, from a heliocentric point of view, Venus is opposition Saturn. Now, I know that the heliocentric chart can be somewhat collective, not quite so personal, but with Venus opposition Saturn, it just may be that you're going to value your own space, and you're not really going to be in the mood for getting too close to any one particular person, maybe. And I think that your boundaries are going to be important, and if you were to try to get close to someone, if you're involved in a close relationship and you spend a time with just one person, it just might feel that something is missing, and it just may be that it's just that you can't give another person everything. Because you've probably got other priorities, but there's also an emotional side of things. I just think you're going to just feel a little bit blocked. That's probably the wrong word to use. That's probably a bit too harsh. But it's just, there's a lot you're going to want to hold back today. And that's okay. It's just the way it is. Venus is, particularly from a heliocentric point of view, is a fast-moving planet. That Venus opposition Pluto is not going to last long. Sorry, not Pluto. Venus opposition Saturn heliocentrically. And in a way, this is supported by the fact that the moon is in Taurus, moon conjunct Uranus in Taurus. So with moon conjunct Uranus in Taurus, I think that many Librans are going to be fairly focused on the way they feel, and I think that you're going to be taking your own feelings quite seriously, and you're not going to just want to reveal everything, and you just may think that some things do have to be kept hidden, and you may be really quite defensive about it, and if anyone asks you too many questions, you might react quite badly. Or maybe not react badly, maybe a better word is to say that you could be, I suppose, be defensive. And I think that is okay. And this conjunction between the moon and Uranus could perhaps also relate to money. And also, it could indeed relate to work if you're working today. And in terms of money and career, material things, I think that you are perhaps going to be more defensive than usual. And you're not going to want to reveal much. And you may also take the view that you perhaps live in a dangerous world, that things could happen. There could be shocks and surprises which could upset everything, and you're just very aware of that. And indeed, there may be a few surprises today that may not just be emotional. They could relate to career. They could relate to money. These surprises happen. Your first instance might be to panic, but it might also be to withdraw inside yourself to work out what's going on. And that's probably the best approach. When you see that something isn't right, then the best approach is to reconsider. Look at what is happening, and do some fine tuning. And this goes back to what I was saying: is that today Librans are going to have a great need for self-improvement, for making sure that things are as good as possible. So when something happens you weren't expecting, maybe you'll just take the view that, well, you hadn't planned for that. Maybe you hadn't got something right, and perhaps your model needs to be fine-tuned. And so perhaps that's another thing that's going on today, is that models need to be fine-tuned. If you've got a plan, if you've got a view of the world, if you've got some expectations, then you've always got to take into account the real world out there, and you've got to be making adjustments all the time as new information comes in. And so today new information might come in, and Librans may just feel that it's time to just make a few changes and not necessarily be satisfied with the changes. There's no such thing almost as a final model, because a final model always has to be adjusted. Of course, there comes a certain point where you can't adjust the model forever, but in the light of external events you can make changes, and I think that those changes are going to be entirely fortunate. Scorpio. The Sun is still sextile Mars, and I have been emphasizing this over the course of this video. It's tempting when I do this kind of astrology to completely focus on exact aspects, because I'm trying to focus on one day at a time, because I do these daily charts, daily chart readings, and you focus on what is exact today, and let's focus on the exact aspects. But aspects, yeah, they become exact, but then they move out of exactitude, and that doesn't mean they've gone away. And this Sun sextile Mars hasn't gone away. It's within a degree. And so Mars is your ruler, and it sextiles the Sun, which means that you're able to impose your personality with relative ease, and you can get people to take you seriously. Yeah, you are serious, and there are things that you want done, and you can make them happen. So really try to push this and consider where your resources are. Sometimes Scorpio, and I think particularly at the moment, you can hold your resources back, and you don't want people to know what you've got. I mean, I suppose not that I play poker, but I suppose, with poker, what is your hand? What hand are you holding? And I suppose that's very important, being able to not reveal your hand. And that's something you are not doing. You are not revealing your hand. And people may actually underestimate you. And if they actually knew what you had at your disposal, they'd probably treat you in a different way. But perhaps it's important to have the element of surprise, and secrecy could be an important part of your success in the near future. And the Sun sextile Mars really is, I think, going to help. Now, as far as what is important to you today, because many things are important to you today, but one thing that does matter to you, Scorpio, is your ability to be yourself and to be free and not to be constrained. That's kind of the last thing you want. And I think you are aware of what is holding you back. There may be commitments that you're slightly annoyed about, that you perhaps signed up to, that you didn't feel maybe you didn't have to sign up to them. But I think that these commitments are not as major as you're imagining. Just because you've agreed to something doesn't mean that you've signed away your soul. It's not like that. This is nothing eternal here. And in fact, many of the things you've signed up to are now starting to lose their strength. If you look at the bonds, I'm thinking of Isn't it like, I mean, I know you're not a Capricorn, but I understand it's like with that tarot card, the Devil, which I know is associated with the sign Capricorn, but maybe today it's also associated with the sign Scorpio. But one of the things about the Devil is you have, what do you have? You have this devil, you have a devil, and you have these people tied to the devil. You know, they're sort of in chains, and it's often pointed out that the chains that these people have are very loose. So you could escape. If these people could escape if they wanted to, they could just slip their wrists out of these metal shackles if they wanted to, but they're not doing it. And maybe you're a bit like that at the moment. You're shackled to something. You believe you've got a commitment. You believe you've got these ties. You believe that your freedom is being constrained by these things you've agreed to. But if you actually analyze what is holding you back, you'll start to realize that it's nothing. You could just slip out of these bonds really easily. So if you are feeling constrained and restricted, it may actually just be a matter of choice. So I think that is kind of good news. So there's no reason to blame anyone else for your lack of freedom. If you have a lack of freedom, it's probably down to you. And I think that it is a time when, Scorpio, you can be yourself. And I think that you're going to be helped by the fact that the moon is now in late Taurus. It's moving out of Taurus, moving into Gemini. And sure, with the moon in Taurus, which is your opposite sign, often connected with relationships and with obligations and with ties and with the other person. With the moon in Taurus, there may be a feeling perhaps that you have to just take into account other people, maybe. And with moon conjunct Uranus, you might feel that, you know, when things don't go right, when there are perhaps unpleasant surprises, it's just down to other people. But the moon is about to move into Gemini, and I think that that's going to give you a greater sense of autonomy. And your moon actually moves into Gemini, if you're in the Americas, this afternoon. Okay, late in the evening if you're in the UK. Tomorrow if you're in anywhere else, pretty much. Maybe Portugal, Spain. I never forget what time zone is Spain on, but if you're in Western Europe, perhaps very late in the day. But tomorrow, moon will be in Gemini, moon will be out of Taurus, Scorpio, and I think that you will really be able to tune into your own freedom. And if you think that something's holding you back, I think that you're just not taking responsibility. You do have agency, and if you want to be yourself, if you want to be free, that's up to you. There's nothing really holding you back. Sagittarius, you're someone who has certainly got a great deal to offer at the moment. And the question is everyone going to accept what you have to offer? So you can feel it. You can feel that you've got a major contribution to make. And it's all about who you are and what you can do, and being able to be dynamic and clever and inspired all at once. And you can be all of those things. But Sagittarius, you just perhaps have to accept that not everyone is going to appreciate you. So you do have to be careful in terms of choosing your friends, choosing your audience, and make sure you go somewhere where you are on the right wavelength. And that might require a little bit of thought, a little bit of planning. Nothing is going to be sort of automatic. So at the beginning of the day, really try to think about what you want to do and how you want to go about it. And don't be afraid of changing your plans. I think there are some plans that you've signed up to that just simply may not be realistic, or if they're not realistic, they may not actually be in keeping with who you are and what you want. You perhaps signed up to something without really thinking about it, and now in the light of day, you're perhaps seeing that a change needs to be made. So it might just be a very good time now to be changing your plans, because by changing your plans, you'll be ensuring that you're able to divert your resources in the right direction, and that you're able to really make the most of everything that you are, and you're able to sort of make the most of your potential. And at the same time, don't be surprised if other people change their plans. So, you can be loyal. You might think that you're doing the right thing, and you just have to honor your promises. But, you might honor your promises, but are other people going to honor their promises? Not necessarily. So it's okay to make changes today. And yeah, it's okay to make changes at short notice. In most cases, of course, there's always a situation where you already are tied to something, but you do have to consider the situation and give yourself maximum potential for doing things your way, and that's okay. But it is about doing things your way, but it's also about doing things carefully your way. It's not a day when you can be sloppy. Now, breaking a promise might sound sloppy, but if you're going to break a promise, you've got to do it in a way that is well planned. You can't just not turn up to something or just say you're not going to do it. You kind of have to perhaps exercise a little bit of diplomacy. A bit of diplomacy wouldn't do any harm, but it's got to be firm, because I think that you've got to be clear about what you want and how you want to present to the world out there what you want to do. So that's possibly the main theme today, Sagittarius. I'm not actually saying that it's going to be an especially active day, and that's especially the case if you're not in the Americas. Now, if you are in the Americas, it is a slightly different picture, because this afternoon the moon changes sign and moves into Gemini. So with the moon moving into Gemini, remember, is your opposite sign, and it does relate to other people. And so with the moon moving into Gemini, it also makes a trine to Pluto. So with moon in Gemini, trine Pluto, you may just feel that something has changed, and you may have a slightly different approach to other people, because Gemini is a sign related to the other, and you're going to perhaps start to become very aware of the social connections around you, and also perhaps aware of your power and your ability to create change. And this change can perhaps be through the things you say, moon trine Pluto. So if something needs to be said and you're an American Sagittarian, then feel free. It's through something you say, you can create a lot of change. But don't just say the first thing that comes into your mind. I mean, moon trine Pluto is a very deliberate and focused aspect. So choose your words. Choose the words that maximize your power, but also which take into account another person's sensibilities, because that's the real way to be powerful. It's not just being entirely positive and giving stuff out. There's something you have to pick up as well. There has to be a negativity to it. Negative as in receiving something, picking up on what kind of person you're dealing with, and then working out how best to manage them and how best to impress your will onto them. But it's a situation where you just have to be a little bit reasonable, but just you mustn't forget what your overarching goals are and what kind of changes you want to bring about. But maybe that's just simply too intense, and perhaps there's a bit too much exaggeration there. Perhaps I should just keep it simple. And so, keeping it simple, if you're an American Sagittarian, then I would simply say, this afternoon, Moon goes into Gemini, and perhaps the emphasis moves on to other people and to relationships, and perhaps that's something that you can explore. Capricorn. You realize, Capricorn, that you are different, and I don't mean that in a negative sense. It's clear to you that you have got a level of creativity that really other people just don't have. Perhaps in the past you thought they did have it, but now it's clear that they don't, and that you're actually able to tune into what makes you special. And I know that many Capricorns do not regard themselves as being special, because Capricorn is quite a modest sign, all things being equal. And so you might be asking, you might be very down to earth about things, asking, why are you special? What contribution have you got to make that it makes you so different? Well, it's very real. And today it's absolutely clear to you. It may just be a single event, just something happens which makes you think, which just makes you realize that you see the world and you respond to the world in a way that is just very different from anyone else. Maybe it's because you're more engaged. Maybe because it's just because you're more serious and you're prepared to give things everything you've got. And while other people are just unreliable, or they just don't give things enough time. They just move on to something else. They're flaky, whatever. But that's not you. So really take into account what you're starting to realize, and just perhaps focus on that thing, on all those things that make you special. And you really do appreciate that. And I do understand it's sometimes very difficult for Capricorns to think that they are special. You might think it's people like let the Leos and the Arians of the world think they're special. But no, it's you that is special, and I think you have every right to be stubborn about it and to hold firm. If something's important to you, then stick with it. And if something has suddenly become important over the course of the last couple of days, then you have to keep it important and you have to make it important. And it's something that really is going to allow you to stand out. And it may be that you have to make a scene, because you shouldn't be prepared to change your plans or to get involved in something that you don't really find interesting, because what you find interesting at the moment really is the thing that really matters. And in the process of working out how special you are, you at the same time can perhaps see where there might be a few gaps. And this is something I've been talking about to you over the last couple of days. And so I know I'm sounding a bit boring and repetitive here, but just a reminder, there is some extra knowledge that needs to be acquired, or you can at least benefit from acquiring it, So as a Capricorn, you understand the importance of substance. You know, a lot of people in this world, they talk about how wonderful they are, how talented they are, and it's all nonsense by and large. People seem to like to lie, but you're a Capricorn, you're not a liar, and you certainly don't lie to yourself. And you understand what's missing, and you understand what you need to do to fill the gaps. That's what I think I used that term, fill the gaps, yesterday, over the weekend, and I think over the last couple of days, just to fill the gaps. And those gaps, I think, might be just in terms of knowledge and education. And it's nothing major, just a few things that you need to know a little bit better, which would really enhance you, would enhance your presence, and would really, remind the world and remind yourself, of course, how special you are, and what you're good at needs to be, you need to just work on it a little bit more. And I think that's perhaps, as you move into this evening and tomorrow, that's going to become even clearer. It's just going to become clearer what remaining work is required, and it will just become quite obvious to you. I think it should already be obvious to you, but as the moon goes into Gemini, okay, if you're in the Americas, the moon goes into Gemini this afternoon, okay, but if you're not in the Americas, then it'll be late this evening or into tomorrow when the moon goes into Gemini. Then you can start to sort of consider what preparations you need to do. Again, it's not very much, but just a few preparations need to be worked on. But Capricorn, yeah, it does seem that you are heading in the right direction, and really respect yourself and do understand how special you are. That really is important. Aquarius, it may be a somewhat problematic day, because perhaps Aquarius, things are going to just happen. Things might happen that you weren't fully prepared for. And there's some danger that they sort of upset your flow. So I think, Aquarius, that is possible. So as you go through the day, just try to be as flexible and open-minded as possible, and try to anticipate things. Because, things can happen just out of the blue. And if you don't have a plan, and if you don't have a response, then you could be stuck. So consider it, consider it. I suppose it's a bit like, sorry, I hope you don't mind this comparison, but I was just thinking about Donald Trump, and when he was shot and when he went down, and I'm just wondering, how was Donald Trump able to respond so quickly to that shooting, but where he was able to understand immediately what kind of image he was supposed to portray to the world. He realized this was an opportunity, that he had to sort of put his fist in the air, and he had to mouth those words, fight, 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 and all this kind of stuff. We don't know, but it may be that, just a speculation here, but perhaps Trump had been imagining for years such an event. He'd been imagining it all the time for this event. What would I do if? What would I do if? And then the event actually happens, and he had already got a plan for what he was going to do. That is just one possibility. So perhaps in this sense, you can perhaps regard Donald Trump as your model. Think about all the things that could happen today. Okay, no one's going to shoot you, but you know what I mean. It's just try to imagine what you would do in any particular situation. And just in whatever you're doing, consider what might go wrong, or consider what might go right. Again, we're talking about something unexpected here, and So you've got a plan, you've got a script, it's all there in order. You don't have to think about it. When the event happens, it's just automatic. You just go and do it. So that might be your approach, so that you're ready when something unexpected happens, something you just hadn't planned for, and you're just ready, you know exactly what to do, you're all prepared, and you're able to take advantage of it. And you might be in a situation where you're able to take advantage of a situation which may actually be quite difficult. And so in a way, you, Aquarius, you may be in a situation where you could really turn the tables. Now that's all a bit lofty. Moving things perhaps to a lower level. For example, you know, if you're spending time at home, you're dealing with your family, as you might have to do, I don't know. You may have to deal with just things not happening as you wanted them to happen. Maybe family members will be playing up. Not just family members, people you know well, who you feel should know better, might be playing up. There might be certain people having tantrums, being very persistent in their behavior, and just not being able to look at things from an alternative point of view. So that is one feature of today that I think you have to be a little bit aware of. Now, that's going to be perhaps more of an issue if you're in Europe, Africa, the Asia, Australia, New Zealand. I think that if you're in the Americas, then as the day progresses, I think that things will probably become easier. Remember, this afternoon in the Americas, the moon moves out of Taurus into Gemini. Okay, it could be early evening. I suppose it depends where you are. I suppose if you're in Brazil, for example, then it's going to be early evening. But the moon moves into Gemini. The moon moves from Taurus into Gemini, and I think overall that does create a certain change, and I think it does make things probably a little easier. And I think people are going to be less troublesome after the moon after the moon moves from Taurus into Gemini, particularly family members. So, you know, by this evening, if you're in the Americas, I do think that you'll have more power at your disposal, and you're going to have more control, and you're going to be helped by the fact that the moon, as it moves into Gemini, makes a trine to Pluto. So with that moon trine Pluto, then you'll be very in tune with who you are and what you can do, and you, I think, will be pretty powerful, but in a positive and creative sense. So perhaps if you're an American Aquarian, you can have a fun evening. Now, if you're not an American Aquarian, if you're in the old world or in Australia or New Zealand, well, don't worry. The moon will go into Gemini tomorrow. In fact, if you're in the UK and in Europe, the moon goes into Gemini right at the end of the day, just before midnight. 10:30 p.m. in London, 10:28 p.m. in London, 11:28 p.m. in Paris. So it kind of depends where you are. But by tomorrow, the moon will be for sure in Gemini, and I'll be talking about that then. Pisces, you're feeling quite good. You're feeling that you're in a position to make things happen, and I think that, you know, the way you can make things happen is probably through the way you communicate. I think, Pisces, you can actually communicate in a pretty powerful way, and people will get your meaning pretty quickly. So you don't have you don't have to make a special effort to get your message across. I think it will be very clear. And in the process of communicating, you're able to get people to sit up and listen. Perhaps it's about creating a surprise. And a surprise is a good way of getting people to listen. I suppose if people are used to you, particularly if they know you well, they're used to the usual things you say. And perhaps if you just say the usual stuff, you're not going to make much of an impact. But you know that. You know that you have to change things a bit. But by saying something dramatic, then people stop what they're doing and they're thinking, what has Pisces got to say? And Pisces has got quite a lot to say. Pisces has got important things to say. And people are just going to really pay attention to you. And, that's good. And in terms of surprises, there are many ways in which you can create surprises. It may not just be through the spoken word or even the written word. It can be through turning up to places. Obviously, you've got to be careful where you turn up to. Sometimes you have to give people warning. Well, I suppose in America people have guns, and if you knock on their door, they can shoot you. But that's an exaggeration. But giving people a surprise, perhaps turning up where you're not expected, can be a useful strategy in certain situations. Because by turning up where you're not expected, well, for one thing, you may be able to see people for what they're for what they really are. If you're expected, people are prepared to are able to prepare themselves. So if you're in a situation where you're trying to understand something, where it's important for you to know what's going on, turning up unexpected just can be a good way of understanding. And if you're trying to make a decision about a person or an offer or something, then a surprise visit can actually be a very good way of working out what's happening. Okay, it may not make you popular, but that's not the point. The point is understanding what is happening, and understanding really does matter. But even if you're not in the mood for surprise visits, I think that it's a time when you're going to be able to communicate extremely well and very powerfully, and by introducing material that people aren't expecting, I think that you will be increasing your advantage. Though you're not the only person on the planet, you're not the only clever person on the planet. There are some clever people that do have to be dealt with. Just remember, Mercury is still in Virgo. Mercury is slowing down a lot now. Mercury is, of course, the ruler of Virgo, which is your opposite sign. Mercury can represent another person. And Mercury is ruler of Virgo. It is strong in this. It is strong in that sign, but Mercury is slowing down, and Mercury goes retrograde on Monday, or in a week's time. And perhaps you should start to prepare yourself for this in terms of other people. Perhaps you need to watch other people starting to slow down. So if you've been with someone for a long time, if there's someone you're familiar with, observe them. Not just today, but observe them over the next week. Observe how they are changing. Observe perhaps how their enthusiasm is changing. Perhaps someone was very enthusiastic about something a week ago, but they're not quite so enthusiastic now. And through this process of monitoring, you can prepare yourself for the events happening after Mercury goes retrograde, because after Mercury goes retrograde, you might find that someone actually does a U-turn, or they might go back on the promises. But people don't just make U-turns and go back on their promises just like that. It's a process. And if anyone is going to break their promises or is going to let you down, The start of a process is now. So watch people's behavior. Watch people's behavior very carefully. And I think this just underlines the overall theme of today. I think today is a day for just information gathering. And you're going to have many opportunities for getting information about who people are, what their real personalities are like, and also I think you're going to be able to predict their next move. You have to be a bit subtle, but I do think it's something you can do. So I think it can be a very informative day, provided you're able to, make the most of it. And I think you can make the most of it. It does require a little bit of effort, even a little bit of deviousness, but I wouldn't worry about it. But every Pisces has to be a little bit devious, don't they? And those are my forecasts for the 12 signs. And I'm now going to look at today, July the 29th, from the perspective of the I Ching. So I asked the question, what is Monday going to be like for those watching the I Ching section of this video? And the first hexagram I got was modesty, number 15. So we've had modesty quite recently, I think, haven't we? So the overall message with modesty is, as you might imagine, it's about not showing off. It's not making a special effort to look good. It's all about being who we are. We don't have to pretend. We don't have to adorn ourselves. And we don't have to boast about having talents that we may or may not have, because who we are and what we can do are absolutely apparent, and they're in our every action. So don't feel you have to be a show-off today. I think that is really important. Now, there are 3 moving lines here. So the second line moves, the fourth line moves, and the fifth line moves. And the second line is really pretty good. It's low profile, but it's good. And it's all about our behavior. It's about us behaving in a way that is just completely natural. Just be natural. Nothing we have to do, just be ourselves. And through our behavior, through our actions, we will be showing ourselves to be modest and unassuming and to be trustworthy. And I think that that is going to be very much appreciated. And so just do what feels right. That's the first thing you need to do today. And you don't even need to do it. It's just going to be obvious. No need to worry about style. No need to make a special effort to impress. In fact, if you were to worry about style and you were to worry about impressing people, then you would be blunting your impact. Then the fourth line moves. And the fourth line is talking about what modesty actually means. And it's giving all sort of alternative views on modesty. And it's telling us to do our job, whatever that job means. I'm not necessarily talking about it in a career sense, but if we've got a position, we need to do our job. It's not a time to be hiding behind that position. Some people have jobs which they get paid for, and they don't do anything in that job, or they just do minimal effort. And that's not modesty. That, in a way, is kind of entitlement, isn't it? It's laziness, it's entitlement, it's disrespect. And so what we have to do is do our job, whatever we're supposed to be doing today, to the best of our abilities. Now, it seems that we can get away with doing less. We can just say, well, we have this job and that's enough, and we can work at half speed or less. We could do that. But real modesty is about accepting what we have to do and doing it to the absolute best of our abilities. And so that is another aspect of what is happening today. So today we're not showing off, but that doesn't mean that we're not doing anything. We have to do our best and not hide behind our role, just think the role itself is enough to say we're doing a good job. No, that's not enough. We have to give it our best. And then we get the fifth line moving. And this is looking at modesty in another way. Modesty is not about being meek. That's not what modesty is about. Sometimes something has to be done, and perhaps this is the crux of the matter here. We can be as modest as we like, but sometimes we have to make a noise. Sometimes we have to get attention. Just because we're seeking attention doesn't necessarily mean we're being immodest. It means that we feel something has to be done. We have decided objectively, it's not about our ego. It's just we know that something has to be done, that something is not right, and it is our obligation to do something about it. And that's, in a way, that is another side of modesty. Modesty is about putting the ego to one side, and just saying, what do we have to do? What do we have to do for ourselves and also for society at large? And that might mean that we have to engage in some kind of a conflict. Sometimes it really is necessary. I'm not advocating that you go have a fist fight or anything like that. You're dealing with perhaps someone who is doing something wrong and needs to be called out. And a conflict may be necessary here. And it's tough, but if something needs to be said, something needs to be said. And then we've got 3 lines moving, and this moves to a second hexagram, which is hexagram 28, which is the preponderance of the great. And it is quite a tough hexagram. It's about a really heavy load. There's a heavy load in the middle, and with these handles that are on the top and the bottom, which can really hardly lift this thing. But it does seem that we can do it. And, this, I suppose, links back with modesty. But, if we looked at the lines when I was talking about modesty, it's not about doing nothing. It's about doing our job, and it's also about making a fuss if something is wrong. And so by doing the right thing, by being modest, we've actually got ourselves into a situation where we are actually carrying quite a heavy load. And this load might almost seem unbearable. Preponderance of the great, it is really tough. And the advice here with preponderance of the great is not to drop the load. That's not what we're supposed to do. Okay, if it's a literal load, yeah, sure, you have to drop it because you might hurt your back, but I'm talking about something metaphorical. The thing is that we have to keep moving, and it is really heavy and it is really tough, but if we keep moving, in the end, we're going to be able to carry this load across the line and accomplish whatever we need to accomplish. And I think it's about being modest, but not being overly modest. We have to sometimes get attention, and we have to do our duty. That's what being modest is about. And in the process because of our modesty, we are in a situation where we are in a difficult situation, where we have taken on a lot. But we've taken on a lot because we know we can do it. We haven't done it because we're trying to show off. It's because there's a sense of obligation plus a feeling that this is something we can do. And we do it, and it's tough. But in the end, we do cross the line, and we are successful. So now I want to look at the royal wedding 43 years ago. And I must emphasize, I am doing this really because it's an astrological exercise. It's not because I particularly care about the royal family. I don't. But we do have some exactly timed charts, and for all of the people involved. And so it's a good way of seeing astrology in action. And the starting point is obviously a marriage. Now, that is something that astrologers do have to deal with. Occasionally, one is asked as an astrologer to choose the time of a marriage. It's something one has to do as an astrologer. It's not necessarily going to make any difference, but it's just one of those preparations, isn't it? When people are getting married, I suppose they I don't know, they can buy flowers, they spend money on all sorts of things, so they might as well spend money on an astrologer. Might as well. It's just part of a preparation. Very often when people get married, it's a time when they spend thousands and thousands of dollars. And so, yeah, paying someone a bit of money to choose the timing of a marriage might help. So one can therefore look at this marriage and ask ourselves, is this a chart of a successful marriage? What would be the signs of a successful marriage? Although, of course, this is a very particular chart. It's a very high-profile chart. So let's start off by looking at this chart in isolation. So here it is, Charles's marriage. Well, I shouldn't have. I said Charles and Diana's marriage, but here's a chart for the moment they got married, I think. So, July the 29th, 1981. I do remember that day. I was in Marrakesh, in Morocco. It's a beautiful city, Morocco, in Marrakesh. It was really hot. So that was what I was doing. It was also the day of a tragedy, actually. It wasn't, people think about the marriage. It wasn't, yes, Charles and Diana got married, but just after the marriage, there was an absolute tragic event. An 8-year-old boy disappeared on that day, and his parents, he'd gone with his family to look at the royal wedding, and he lived in Putney, Putney is in southwest London, just south of the river, and he disappeared. And his name was Vishal Mehrotra, and he disappeared on that day. And he was kidnapped. I think his remains were found the next day. I remember, the reason I think about that is because that autumn was my first autumn when I went to university, and I was living in Putney for a few months, and there were posters all over the place talking about how this boy had disappeared really close to where I was living, and it mentioned the fact that he had disappeared on the day of a royal wedding. Yeah, unfortunately, his remains were found the year after, and I think they're sort of still investigating it. I mean, things are still going on. I looked on a Wikipedia. There's actually a Wikipedia page on it. There was still stuff going on in 2023. And I suppose that's a reminder that one thing that was happening at the time of the royal marriage was there was a Mars-Saturn square. Mars was it was separating, but Mars-Saturn square suggests that it wasn't an entirely happy day. And we just should remember that it wasn't that on that day the marriage wasn't the only thing going on. And another thing going on, when you look at a chart, it's all, particularly kind of a royal wedding, it's always a good idea to look at the cultural environment and the outer planet, Jupiter, Saturn. Look at Jupiter and Saturn at the beginning of at the time of a royal marriage. There was almost an exact Jupiter-Saturn conjunction, 20 minutes apart. So what the Jupiter-Saturn conjunction represents is a new beginning. It's the start of a new Jupiter-Saturn cycle. And this was the beginning. It started with the royal wedding. And I suppose if you think about the 1980s, you think of Diana, don't you? And you think of, I suppose you think of all the aspects of 80s style and what the 80s was like. I suppose you think of whatever music was around in the 1980s. Not that I was paying attention. What do you think of? Duran Duran? I don't know. I don't know anything about Duran Duran. All that kind of stuff. You think about the 1980s and London in the 1980s, the Sloane Rangers, that was one aspect of it, and these young people yuppies, young, upwardly mobile people. And so that was perhaps London, but it was perhaps the world. Reagan and Thatcher were just coming into. Thatcher was getting into. Well, she became prime minister in 1979, but Thatcherism and Reagan, they started really getting into their swing with the Jupiter-Saturn conjunction. So this was the beginning of a new Jupiter-Saturn cycle, and in a way, the royal wedding really started it all off. No, I won't say it started it all off, but it was a real marker of it. Now, it's easy, isn't it, to be critical. Now we know after the event that the marriage perhaps wasn't particularly successful. It ended in divorce. But we have to try and look at this chart in isolation and say there's a lot of good stuff about this chart. The moon is on the midheaven, right on the midheaven in Cancer. It's almost as if that was chosen by an astrologer, having the moon in Cancer on the midheaven. That's great. Moon is sextile Venus. Again, what better aspect to have for a royal wedding? And look at Venus and Mars. Venus and Mars. There's a Venus sextile Mars. Again, that is, to my mind, pretty good, isn't it? So there's good stuff going on in this chart. But of course, there are some problems in this chart. But remember, when we talk about the problems in this marriage, this is done with 20/20 hindsight. In many respects, this is a good chart, but there are a few problems. What I don't like about the chart is that all of the traditional planets, Sun, Moon, Mercury, Venus, Mars, Jupiter, Saturn, are above the horizon. It's just a bit too much. It's a bit too in public. It's a public event. What about the individuals involved? Charles and Diana, they are having to be in public, and you can actually see the pressure there of the public, and the absolute scrutiny of the public, of the paparazzi, and of course the way it all ended for Diana when I suppose journalists were they chasing her? I don't know. In that tunnel in 1997. Of course, this is what Harry is very upset about, isn't it? So it is very public. Now, there are a couple of other issues. Venus is exalted in Pisces, so it is fallen in Virgo. And Mars is exalted in Capricorn, so it is fallen in Cancer. So although there is a Venus sextile Mars, with Venus being ruler of the ascendant, I suppose we could say Venus is Diana. I suppose we have to say that. Mars is ruler of the 7th house. Well, because it's a male planet, it has to be Charles. But the fact that you've got Venus and Mars both fallen, there's always this tension in astrology between dignity and aspect. And in terms of dignity, I think there is cause for concern here. And it may be the fact that Venus and Mars don't have any dignity, in fact are fallen, even though Mars does rule by triplicity. Mars rules the water triplicity using William Lilly's scheme of things, and Venus rules the earthy triplicity by day. So they're not peregrine, they have some dignity, but still both planets being fallen, I think, is a serious problem there. Now, as far as hypotheticals, there is something about hypotheticals which I think we need to point out here. So one hypothetical planet which I don't really talk about too much is Cupido. Cupido is kind of like a sort of like Venus a bit, and it's the glyph of Cupido is Jupiter with Venus put into it. Let me just show you what the glyph looks like. So here is the let's put the hypotheticals in, or what? Yeah, let's put the hypotheticals in. So there is Cupido. You can see it's a sort of Jupiter symbol with a Venus imposed upon it. So this planet, it's about love, but it's about unions, and it's about community. And at the time of the marriage, the Sun was at 613 Leo, and Cupido was at 6-4 Scorpio. So there was an exact Sun-Cupido square. Now that takes us to the midpoints of the Sun and Cupido. So if we look at the midpoints of Sun and Cupido, because they're exactly there, I don't know whether you can see this, but you can see that Sun is on the Venus-Mars midpoint, which is of course great. Venus-Mars, Venus, planet of female sexuality, Mars, planet of male sexuality, Sun conjunct the Venus-Mars midpoint. That is absolutely great, something you'd really want to have in a marriage. Sun is also conjunct the Venus-Jupiter midpoint, and Sun is also on the Venus-Saturn midpoint. But Cupido, there's the tree for Cupido is likewise conjunct the Venus-Mars midpoint, Venus-Jupiter midpoint, Venus-Saturn midpoint. And so if we look at this on the midpoint tree, where you see there is Cupido, there is the Sun, and so we can see Venus, Sun and Cupido really closely together, because this is 45 degrees. This is the 45 degree dial. So there you are. There you've got Venus Mars and Venus Jupiter, but Venus Saturn is there as well. So there may be a certain sense of something being repressed, possibly there, but still having Sun and Cupido on the Venus-Mars and Venus-Jupiter. Venus-Jupiter is, Cupido on the Venus-Jupiter midpoint really is about happiness. I mean, let me just tell you what Vita says about Cupido on the Venus-Jupiter midpoint. So Cupido on the Venus-Jupiter midpoint, he says, Cupido on the Venus-Jupiter midpoint is love's happiness in marital life, much luck and happiness through a union, association, or in the family. So, that's really good. Cupido on the Venus-Mars midpoint, it's talking about sex, everything's fine, because it's Venus-Mars, it's about sexuality, so, it's looking good. So that is the marriage chart. Now let's consider it from the perspective of Diana. How did this marriage impact her? So here is Princess Diana's chart. Let's make this a bit smaller. One thing about Diana that, I was talking about Venus-Uranus squares think in my last video, and for some bizarre reason, I missed out Princess Diana. Why didn't I not? I don't know how I missed that. Princess Diana has Venus square Uranus. Remember, we've got Venus square Uranus coming up later this week. So Venus square Uranus is perhaps presenting an interesting side to her personality, doesn't it? I mean, Venus square Uranus, she has a way of doing things. This may suggest someone who has unstable relationships, perhaps. It may suggest someone who can fall in and out of love, and might also suggest someone who's looking for excitement. And, relationships are important, and she's perhaps, in her own way, quite selfish about the kind of relationship she wants. Venus square Uranus. And so, we always think about Charles having this relationship with Camilla, but there's also Diana to consider. I think that she was looking for variety and excitement in relationships, and when Charles wasn't providing it, she started to move on. And she certainly has Venus square Uranus and Venus square the moon. So she has this T square, Uranus opposition the moon, with Venus on the T. And so we shouldn't forget that aspect of Diana's personality. Another thing about her personality, I've been talking about Black Moon Lilith, and Diana has a Saturn opposition with Black Moon Lilith. This is, of course, true Black Moon Lilith, and I will be talking more about Black Moon Lilith a bit later. So that's Diana's, some aspects of Diana's chart. My aim is not really to go into detail about Diana's chart. That chart has been done to death. So the question is, what impact did the wedding have for her? So here is Princess Diana in the middle, and on the outer wheel is what the planets were doing. And, it doesn't really have a great deal of an impact on her. There's nothing massive here. Yeah, Pluto is roughly on her midheaven. I mean, that kind of fits, doesn't it? This girl, she's just, by the time she married, she was just out of her teens. She's 20 years old, Uranus on the midheaven, being plunged into the limelight. And so that really, really kind of fits. Chiron transiting Chiron, pretty close to her Venus. So there is a sense of uncertainty, and I won't say, just uncertainty and feeling a little bit overwhelmed by it, but not really feeling very comfortable by the whole thing. But in terms of pure transits, there's not actually a great deal happening. I mean, Pluto on the midheaven is the main thing. I probably missed something. You probably noticed something absolutely major that I haven't noticed, but there's not a great deal happening. She's had transiting Neptune on her ascendant. I mean, I suppose, it's Neptune-Pluto. Neptune-Pluto represent these overwhelming forces. Things are out of control. Once she'd agreed to marry Charles, she had unleashed these forces that this poor woman just could not cope with. And there is Pluto on the midheaven, Neptune on the ascendant. It was pretty close to each other. So I think that sort of describes perhaps the experience she was going through. Then we look at Charles's chart, and he is now King Charles, but Charles's chart. Notice that Diana had in her chart Saturn opposition true Black Moon Lilith. Charles also has Saturn opposition Black Moon Lilith, by the way. I think that's just quite interesting. I don't really want to say anything about, well, I think with Charles, one should never forget that he's got Jupiter opposition Uranus. Charles's freedom is quite important to him. He likes to express himself. He doesn't like to be have imposition on him. He's and it may be a bit selfish. He does what he wants to do, perhaps with Jupiter opposition Uranus. And yeah, I'm not going to really go into his chart apart from just pointing out that Saturn on the black moon Lilith. So looking at what the wedding did to Prince Charles, here I think it has a much more powerful impact on him than it did to Diana. So Charles has his sun at 5 degrees 24 Leo. And so the sun was just crossing his ascendant. So that was a big deal. Okay, it's a short-term aspect, but I think it's quite a major aspect there, given the fact that it's a day of marriage. Venus is conjunct his Saturn. Now, that might represent cause for concern. Do you really want to get married when Venus is conjunct your Saturn? In fact, Venus is hitting his Saturn, Black Moon, Lilith opposition. I don't know. You could say, if you were positive about it, Saturn is all his restrictions and duty and obligation, and Venus is trying to unlock it. So perhaps this is a challenge to who he is. Maybe that is a possibility. But again, look at the the Saturn was semisextile, very closely semisextile his Saturn as well. So there's something somewhat difficult about that marriage, and certainly it's not, I don't think he's feeling great about it, really. I don't think. So those are a few points about how it's occurring to Charles. Now, something very unfortunate about this marriage, it's kind of unfair on Diana about the marriage, is the fact that you had the sun at 6 degrees Leo, and you had the moon at 13 degrees Cancer. And so when you look at the chart of Camilla, the sun wasn't just going over Charles's ascendant, it was going over Camilla's ascendant as well, it's almost like Camilla was part of a marriage, because the sun in that marriage chart was reflecting Camilla, and the moon was at 13 Cancer, and Camilla's moon was at 10 Cancer. So in a way, it seems that Camilla's impression is on the marriage chart. So it's kind of not surprising that, perhaps Charles, had this affair with Camilla at a fairly early stage in the marriage. And so that is somewhat disturbing. Now, looking at the comparison between Charles and Diana, how did these two people match? Was it a good match? That's Diana's chart. So perhaps we'll ask, what did Charles do to Diana? What kind of relationship did they have? Were there any amazing aspects between the two of them? And so Charles's chart in the middle, Diana's chart on the outer wheel. Diana's Jupiter was on Charles's descendant. I suppose that's nice, because Diana's Jupiter was, I suppose, making Charles feel good. This was someone to marry. but there's something a little bit formal about it. Almost like he was going to marry someone who had Jupiter maybe at 5 Aquarius. He was going to marry someone young, much younger than him, Jupiter on his descendant, and so there's a fit there. Diana's Mars is on his Saturn. So I suppose Mars would be what she's looking for in the opposite sex. And so what does she find? She finds Saturn in Virgo. So maybe in the first instance, there might have been a point of attraction, that Diana did feel a certain sense of attraction towards Charles with that Mars-Saturn conjunction. But of course, as the marriage unfolded, that Mars-Saturn conjunction would become, I would have said, very frustrating. So I think there could have been a bit of an issue there. But overall, I don't think that there is a great deal of connection between the two. Now, I should say, people go on and on about synastry and how good it is to have all these interconnections between your chart. You could argue that if two people have nothing to do with each other, astrologically, they've got no synastry, maybe that's the best thing to happen, because where you've got astrological connections between two charts, Venus conjunct his Venus conjunct her Mars or whatever, when you've got that, there could be compulsion. It's the reason why the marriage happens, but then it quickly goes wrong. Ideally, perhaps there should be no synastry at all, but though in this case, there does seem to be a sense of convenience here. She was the right person. It was suitable in where he was in his stage of life, and I think that is a bit of a problem. Now, the composite chart. So the composite chart is done, roughly speaking. You take the midpoint. You take the midpoint of her sun, his sun. You take the midpoints. Then you take the midpoint of their midheavens, and then you use a table of houses to look at the latitude of where they meet or where they're married or where they're going to live. So I taking the latitude of London to get the ascendant. So here is the composite chart of Charles and Diana. Now, if two people have the same aspect, so if one person has Venus-Mars sextile and the other person both have a Venus-Mars sextile, then you will also see a Venus-Mars sextile in the composite chart. Now, I've said that Charles and Diana both had a Black Moon Lilith opposition in their charts. That means, by definition, in the composite chart, you will get a Black Moon Lilith opposition. A Black Moon Lilith Saturn opposition, and there it is, right across the ascendant. Now we got this ascendant. Remember, I took the midpoints of Charles's midheaven and Diana's midheaven. You take the midpoint, and then you take something called a table of houses. Of course, the computer doesn't need a table of houses. And you read off what the ascendant would be for that particular latitude, for the latitude of London. So in this case, the ascendant is 12 degrees 48 Taurus. So that Black Moon Lilith Saturn opposition, which they both have, is in the composite chart, and it is exactly on the ascendant. And obviously that's not good. It's pretty dark and pretty deceptive. But there are other things going on in the composite chart. Mars-Neptune conjunction, more exact Mars-Neptune conjunction, all kinds of deceptions going on, all sorts of games, and people not really knowing what they're doing. And I don't think that's very healthy in terms of a relationship. But you've got Jupiter and Capricorn on the midheaven in the composite, and I suppose I don't know whether you should use exaltations and falls in composite charts, but Jupiter on the midheaven, it's a high-profile marriage. It really is. And so that's a composite. But I do think that Black Moon Lilith opposition to Saturn is really quite powerful, isn't it? So that's the marriage, and that's the connection between Diana's chart and Charles's chart, and I've thrown in a bit about Camilla. Now this then raises a question: can you treat the marriage chart as an event, something that can take transits and that can take transits to the marriage chart? So going back to the marriage chart, I suppose if we are optimistic about it, the first big event, one might say, after they got married was the birth of their first child. Birth of the first child is, I suppose, an important event in any marriage. And so we would just simply do a comparison between the marriage chart and the birth of Prince William. So then we just put Prince William on the outer wheel. So here we're not so much talking about Prince William as a person, it's about just like what were the events going on when Prince William was born. And there's one major event, and that is simply the North Node. The moon was at the time of the marriage was at 1341 Cancer. So the North Node was conjunct the moon exactly when Prince William was born, and the North Node was also pretty close to the midheaven up there. You might also notice that Mars and Saturn were on the ascendant. I don't think it was a particularly negative event for the marriage, Prince William being born, but it's perhaps something that needs to be borne in mind. And the fact that you had Sun opposition Dark Moon Lilith. William, by the way, has Dark Moon Lilith, mean Dark Moon Lilith on his ascendant, and their opposition to Sun. The ascendant at the time of the birth was on, if you're interested, it was on a Neptune Dark Moon Lilith midpoint. I don't know what that says about William. I'm not sure. But I think the key point about that chart is the fact that the North Node is on the midheaven. I think, and most importantly, it's conjunct the moon. So that's one event. Now, it has been said that from Diana's perspective, she knew the marriage was over when Prince Harry was born. I think that when Prince Harry was born, Charles was upset that it wasn't a girl. He'd wanted a girl. That's the story. And Charles's reaction to Harry really upset Diana, at least that's what we're led to believe. So how does the marriage relate to, how does the wedding relate to so what about Harry? What was the impact on the marriage of Harry? And so there's Prince Harry. Well, I think this is interesting because Harry was born with Dark Moon Lilith square his ascendant and so Dark Moon Lilith was square the ascendant when Harry was born, and Dark Moon Lilith was on the descendant. And I'm still trying to work out what to make of Dark Moon Lilith. One thing I'm very sure about is one should use the true Dark Moon Lilith rather than the mean Dark Moon Lilith. I think that is pretty clear. I mean, logically it's clear as well, because, you know, the definition of what does Black Moon Lilith, what does Black Moon Lilith mean? Black Moon Lilith is relates to apogee, when the moon is furthest from the Earth. And so it is absolutely logical that at the point where the moon is furthest from the Earth, you would expect the moon to be conjunct black moon Lilith. And when it's nearest to the Earth, you'd expect it to be opposition. If you use the true black moon Lilith, that isn't entirely the case. And there's a particular problem on oppositions when the moon is at perigee. It can be a long way off the exact opposition to black moon Lilith. But there is true black moon Lilith exactly on the descendant at the time of Harry's birth. I mean, when I say directly on descendant, directly on the marriage descendant, and it was square the ascendant at the time of birth. So that's why Harry has black moon Lilith square the ascendant. So that's perhaps the start of things going wrong. And then we've got two other events, which is the separation. So the separation took place, I believe the formal separation of, when they announced the separation, was on December the 9th, 1992. So this is a chart for the separation. Notice on the separation chart that Diana and Charles both have moon opposition black moon Lilith. That means, of course, that they had their moon, both were born at with Saturn quite close to the perigee point of the moon, when the moon was closest to the sun. Sorry, when the moon was closest to the Earth. So they both have had Saturn black moon Lilith oppositions, but at the time of their separation, we've got a Saturn black moon Lilith conjunction. And so that's a separation chart. So how does this separation chart relate to the marriage? So inner wheel, we've got the marriage. Outer wheel, we've got the separation chart. And Jupiter is close to the ascendant. So Jupiter on the ascendant is about making clear what is obvious. There's a kind of relief here with Jupiter on the ascendant. It's becoming clear that the marriage is not going to work. That's one point. Then you've got Uranus fairly close to the IC. So as Uranus was on the IC, it was just moving to the marriage IC. It was just destabilizing things and leading to the separation. So Uranus and Jupiter are pretty much where you would expect them to be. Uranus on the IC, Jupiter on the ascendant. It's perhaps a new beginning. And again, so there is, I think, a sense of relief here. And look at the moon on that. I don't know precisely what time they separated, but the moon is, there's a moon trine Jupiter, moon trine the ascendant. So we also got Mercury conjunct Uranus, the announcement, surprise, and so that I think sort of fits quite well. Then we've got the actual divorce, and so here's a divorce. Saturn at 6 Aries conjunct the South Node. So this is when it finally ends. It's not just a separation, they are ending. The marriage is over. And so again, here's a marriage chart, here's a divorce chart. So what's interesting about this marriage is that Charles and Diana got married on a Jupiter-Saturn conjunction. Very close Jupiter-Saturn conjunction. And they got divorced 16 years later, when Jupiter and Saturn were square. And look at this Saturn. Saturn was opposition the Jupiter-Saturn conjunction in the marriage chart. Jupiter was almost exactly opposition Mars. Saturn was square Mars. So this Mars square the Jupiter-Saturn conjunction was being triggered by a Jupiter-Saturn square, which was taking place at the time of a divorce. So we've also got Chiron fairly close to the ascendant. So what I'm trying to say here is that we can look at the marriage chart as an event which seems to take transits, both transits for good events like the birth of Prince William, and also for more difficult events like the separation and divorce of Charles and Diana. I finally wanted to look at the horoscope of the marriage in isolation without looking at Charles and Diana's chart, but I wanted to look at the horoscope of the marriage from a Vedic perspective. So normally when Vedic charts, I usually set up Vedic charts for people. I don't set up Vedic charts for organizations and events like marriages and so forth. But I thought I'd just see what the marriage looked like from a Vedic perspective. And so here is the Vedic chart, the chart of the marriage from a Vedic view. And a couple of points here. Saturn was in Libra at the time of the marriage in the Western chart. So Saturn goes back into Virgo. And so likewise, so basically in the marriage chart, we had Saturn in Libra and we had the ascendant in Libra. So, but Saturn was in the 12th house in the Western marriage chart. But if we look at it from a Vedic view, then Saturn and the ascendant, they're both in the same sign. So it has Saturn rising. And Mars, remember it was in Cancer, Mars goes back into Gemini. So there's a very Saturnine feel to this chart. Saturn in Virgo, Saturn's conjunct Jupiter. Yeah, there is a Saturn-Jupiter conjunction, but there is something fundamentally Saturnine about this relationship. And we've got Mars on the midheaven. Look at the moon. The weakest planet in the chart using Shadbala, which is this sixfold strength, is the moon. And I would have thought a relationship needs a good moon. And the moon is a problem, because the moon is not just weak by Shadbala, but the moon goes back into Gemini. By the way, in the Vedic chart, moon is not just weak in terms of Shadbala, but it's hemmed in. It's hemmed in by Mercury and Mars. So that is a bit of a problem on either side of the moon. But also, this is a waning chart. In Vedic astrology, by and large, as a generalization, the moon is a benefic when it's waxing. It's a malefic when it's waning. And so the moon is really not in great shape, even though it's prominent in the 10th house. And so that's the moon is under a bit of pressure there. And so I think that the Vedic chart in a way is kind of easier than the Western chart. It's kind of clearer that there might be a problem here. And then I was thinking, well, can we use the Vimshottari Dasha system to work out how the marriage unfolds? Can we treat it like a birth? Can we, I don't know. I've never used the Vimshottari Dasha system with events. I've normally focused on individuals. So the Vimshottari Dasha system is a system where you divide life into 120 portions, into 9 portions covering 120 years. And so in terms of a Vimshottari Dasha system, it's it started in the Jupiter Dasha. It started with the Jupiter Dasha. That was what it started in. Jupiter's quite strong here, you could say, although it is conjunct Saturn. Jupiter's in the first house. It's by Shadbala, it's not particularly weak. But then I'm thinking, just before I looked at this chart, I noticed that the marriage, not just the marriage, if you take the view that marriages can't be ended, the time between the marriage and Diana's death was 81 to 97, was just over 16 years. Pretty much 16 years and a bit. So I was thinking before I set this chart up, I wonder if it started on a Jupiter Dasha, right at the beginning of a Jupiter Dasha. That was my kind of my first instinct before even looking at this chart. And indeed, it did start on a Jupiter Dasha, as I thought. And the Jupiter Dasha lasted it started actually, it's the actual Jupiter Dasha, if you take it before the actual event, sort of started on June the 19th, 1981, which would have been 6 weeks before they were, 5 or 6 weeks before they were married. And so that would run through until June the 19th, 1997. So even though we're talking about divorces and separations, but maybe from a sort of cosmic perspective, the divorces and separations don't really matter. Maybe they're just married anyway. The divorces and separations are just human changes. But what about from the broad cosmic picture? So after 16 years, on June the 19th, 1997, the marriage moved from being in a Jupiter Dasha to a Saturn Dasha. And so there is Saturn, pretty difficult, I would have said, right on the ascendant. Saturn is obviously making an opposition to the 7th house. If you take the view that Saturn aspects the 10th house from itself, Saturn is arguably aspecting the 10th house here. So as the Saturn Dasha started, June the 19th, 1997, that is the point where Diana's life was at risk, and I suppose just over 2 months after the Saturn Dasha started, Diana died, was killed in the crash in Paris. So I think there is evidence here that setting up a marriage, even using the Dashas, the Vimshottari Dasha system, might be effective. And we can even perhaps see when the marriage perhaps started running into problems. Look, the Jupiter Mahadasha started the Saturn sub-period of the Jupiter Dasha started in 1983. So maybe as early as August 1983, just after William was born, when I suppose at that time she was about to a few months later, she would have got pregnant with Harry. So maybe as early as August 1983, with Jupiter Major Dasha, Mahadasha, Saturn Minor Dasha, the marriage was already running into problems. And of course it was during that period that Harry was born. It was during that period, Jupiter Mahadasha, Saturn Subdasha, where Diana kind of realized that it was all over, or might be over, via Charles's response to Harry being born as a woman, born as a boy. I think, if it's true that he'd wanted a girl, and his reaction to Diana, that was all in that Saturn sub-period. Okay, that's all I'm going to say about Charles and Diana. I'm sorry if you find the royal family of zero interest. I'm not particularly interested in the royal family myself, but it's, I think, a good illustration of how astrology might be working or indeed might not be working. So I hope you found that video of some interest. If you did enjoy the video, I'd be very grateful if you were to like it, and if you enjoyed it and you're not subscribed, I'd be super grateful if you were to subscribe. And if you want to buy me a coffee, there is a link in the description, and I will talk to you again tomorrow.